This is starting at chapter 6 of book 14 of Boccaccio's Encyclopedia of Gentile Gods. Rather than getting the whole extremely long and boring encyclopedia, I am just getting his rants about storytelling at the end. This was translated from Latin. The whole encyclopedia can be read here. Chapter 6. Poetry is a useful resource. A little man entering the gymnasium against these gigantic masses, strengthening them with the authority with which they can. I think that poetry would be either no or a futile faculty, if he inquired before others what poetry is, or what his duty revolves around. I think he would have done nothing else, than to have found a knot in the bow. But since it must be done, I ask that these excellent teachers of all faculties open it up, so that it may be seen what our struggle is about. I know that, with obstinate brows, and no blush ever flushed, they will laugh and say what was wrongly said a little while ago. Oh good God, sit down and take notice of these ridiculous objections, and direct steps for their betterment. They therefore say, in condemning poetry, that it is absolutely non-existent. But if this is so, I would like to know, whence so many illustrious men have long since asked for the name of a poet. Where did the many volumes of poems come from? Whence this name arose in poetry, if poetry is nothing? Certainly, if they are to answer for anything, I think they will go through Dieters, since they have nothing to answer by right, except that it is against their empty position. For it is most certain, that after this it will be pointed out in its place, that this, like the rest of the discipline, had its beginning from God, from whom all wisdom, and, like the rest, the name was drawn from the effect, from which finally the famous name of the poets was derived, and from thence the poems by the poets. As they stood, it would appear that poetry was nothing at all, as they said. And if there is knowledge, what do they say to the crying sophist? I believe they will withdraw their foot a little, or rather, flying over to the second part of the objection because of the disintegrative copula, they will say, if there is a chance, it is a futile chance. Oh ridiculous rascal, it would have been better for him to have remained silent, than to have plunged himself into a greater error with frivolous words. Do they not see that they are ignorant of this very name? Capacity, of course, meaning always to show some kind of fullness. But about this another time. And how can these elegant men express, by what right the possibility of poetry can be said to be futile, with his instigation, under the auspices of divine grace, there are so many bright volumes, so many poems to be remembered, so many transparent and foreign inventions. They will be silent, indeed, if they suffer the vain display of vanity. But what? Shall they be silent, I say? They would rather die than confess the truth, not with their lips, but in silence. They will rush into another passage, and in their interpreting judgment they will say that this adjective should be understood as futile and harmful and detestable, because the poems, coming from poetry, sing of their gods and suggest allurements and strange things. Although this interpretation may be rejected, since it is not futile, as it is full of allurement, yet it could be tolerated with a good mind, if, as they will for its sake, it might reasonably be admitted, when it is confessed that there would be no poems expressing what they assert, for which reason they would have one, if a bad species could derogate from a good race. But I beseech you, if Praxiteles or Pheidias, the most learned sculptors, had carved the impudent Priapus tending to Iolus by night, rather than the respectable fair Diana, or if he had painted Apelles, or our Ioctus, in whose age Apelles was not superior, mixing with Mars or Venus rather than Jupiter from the gods, shall we say that these arts are to be condemned, granting rights to the throne? It would be very foolish to admit. Indeed, this is the fault of lascivious geniuses. In the same way, for a long time now, there has not been any poet, if such poets are to be called, who, either by reason, or to earn the favor of the people, thus the searching age and the allurement of lasciviousness, who, abandoning honesty, fall into these follies. And damningly they are to be hated and rejected, as will be said later. On account of this, however, the crime of certain pretenders is not to be universally condemned in poetry, from which we read so many exhortations to the virtues and admonitions in documents of the poets, by those who took care to describe the heavenly meditations with sublime genius, and with the utmost honesty, and ornamentation of style and words. But what many? Poetry is not only something, but a venerable science, and, as has often been seen in the foregoing and will appear in the following, it is not a futile, but a juicy faculty, to squeeze the senses out of fictions by the genius of those who wish. And so it is evident, that we may not prolong the conversation any further, that, at the first entry into the conflict, the generals gave these men their rear, and with a little effort we cleared the field of the duel. But what poetry is must be explained, that they may see for themselves how foolishly they think of that futile faculty. Chapter 7. What is poetry, whence the words, and what is its function? For poetry, which the negligent and the ignorant discard, is a certain fervor of finding and saying or writing exquisitely what you find. He who, proceeding from the bosom of God, is granted to a few minds, as I think, in creation, from which, since he is wonderful, he must always be the rarest poet. For this fervor has sublime effects, such as to compel the mind to a desire to speak, to devise strange and unheard of inventions, to arrange meditations in a certain order, to adorn the composition with an unusual context of words and sentences, to cover the truth with a fabulous and decent veil. Moreover, if the invention seeks, to arm kings, to lead them into wars, to send out classes from the ships, to describe the heavens, the earth, and the horses, to mark the virgins with wreaths and flowers, to designate the actions of men for their qualities, to irritate the dull, to animate desires, to restrain the reckless, to conquer the sons, and to extol the distinguished by their merits with praise, and many such things, but if any one of those in whom this fervor is infused does this less fully, in my judgment he will not be a praiseworthy poet. Moreover, no matter how much it urges the minds into which it is infused, the impulse seldom accomplishes anything admirable, if the instruments with which they are wont to accomplish their meditations have failed, as, for example, grammatical precepts and rhetoric, the full knowledge of which is opportune, they performed poetry services. Hence it is necessary that he should have known at least the principles of liberal arts and other moral and natural arts, and not only that he had an abundance of vocabulary, that he had seen the monuments of his ancestors, and that he also remembered the histories of nations, and the dispositions of the regions of the world, of the seas, of the rivers, and of the mountains. Besides, deserts are delightful by nature, and in a convenient way, so is the tranquility of the mind and the appetite for secular glory, and the ardor of age is always of great benefit, for if they fail in this, the intellect is never numbed by thought. And since from this fervor, sharpening and illuminating the powers of the genius, nothing but artificial art proceeds, for the most part vocal poetry. Indeed, the name of whose poetry did not arise from that, whence most people think less consciously, that is, from poiopoi, which sounds the same as what you imagine, but rather from poets, the oldest Greek word in Latin sounding exquisite expression. For the first, who, inspired by the spirit, were to speak exquisitely in a still crude age, as if in poetry, a kind of speech completely unknown at that time, so that even the sounds of the ears of the listeners could be seen to regulate it in times of wait, and in order not to take away the pleasure by too much brevity, or be seen to induce tedium by excessive length, we must check the number of feet and syllables defined below by certain rules of measurement. Of course, what leaped out of this precise order of speech was no longer called poetry, but a poem. And so, as we have already said, the name was obtained from the effect both of the art and of the artifice. Perhaps these accusers will ask that I am transparent, and if I say that I infuse this knowledge from the bosom of God into souls fresh from the bosom of God, they will not be willing to give enough faith to my words, which they could have given to the strong souls of horses that we constantly see, but we still need witnesses. If, therefore, they read what Tullius Cicero, a philosopher and not a poet, said in the speech which he gave before the Senate on behalf of Aulus Licinius Archia, perhaps they will become more easily convinced. For he says thus, and so we received from the highest and most learned men. The studies and learning of other things must be established both in the precepts and in the art, that the poet should be strong by nature itself, and be awakened by the powers of the mind, and be inspired, as it were, by some divine spirit, etc. Therefore, that I may not prolong my speech any further, it may be sufficiently evident to pious men that poetry is a faculty, and that it derives its origin from the bosom of God, and that it takes its name from its effect, and that it ascribes to it many signs and auspicious things, which those who deny themselves constantly make use of. If they complain, where or when, it is readily available, do they themselves admit the wood guide, by whose work they themselves compose their fictions, while they erect ladders with distinct steps to heaven, while tall trees produce fruitful branches and horses to the stars, while they circumambulate the mountains to the highest. They will say, perhaps, that they may deduct from him, unknown to themselves, what they use rhetorically, that they need that I, on the other hand, will not be infected. For it has its rhetorical inventions, but in the covers of fictions there are no rhetorical parts, whatever is composed and expounded exquisitely under a veil is mere poetry. Chapter 8. In this part of the world poetry first shown. If, my king, you inquire under what plague of heaven, in what centuries, by whose work this first appeared on earth, I hardly believe that a sufficiently certain answer can be given. Some, however, are of the opinion that this had its origin with the sacred ceremonies and ceremonies of old, and thus arose among the Hebrews, as evidenced by the sacred sacrifice offered by them to the first god, in which it is read that Cain and Abel, brothers, and the first men born in the world, sacrificed to God, so also by Noah, when the waves of the cataclysm ceased, when he left the ark, it was finished as sacred to God, moreover, by Abraham, having overcome his enemies, while Melchizedek offered wine and bread to the priest. Of course, when what is complained of is not summed up from these, since those who prophesied rather than proved it asserted that it was by no means necessary to judge that these sacraments had been completed without any utterance of words, they add from Moses, when he had crossed the Red Sea on dry foot, together with the people of Israel, completely finished, when we read that he found the shrines and the priests and the tabernacle, erected in the likeness of the future temple, and the prayers by which the divinity was appeased. Looking at these, it will be seen that poetry had its beginnings among the Hebrews not before Moses, the leader of the Israelites. Indeed, near the end of the life of Maradi, king of the Scythians, who died on that day in the year of the world 3 AD, he led the people and completed the ceremonies. There are also others who wish to bestow this glory upon the Babylonians. Among those Venetus, the bishop of Puteolanus, the greatest investigator of histories, was wont to assert, with protracted eloquence, that the poetry of Moses was far more ancient, as if it arose in the time of Nemroth, for he said that he was the first to discover idolatry, because he had seen fire prepared for mortals. And from his movements and various murmurings he could learn certain things of the future. He confirmed that he was a god, and for this reason he not only worshipped and persuaded the Chaldeans, but also built temples for him, ordained priests, and even invented prayers. In these prayers he showed that he had an excellent use of speech, which is possible, but he did not explain clearly whence he got it. But I, even if I had read very carefully that among the Assyrians the worship of religion, the study of philosophy, and the glory of weapons were the first, yet without other evidence more worthy of belief, I do not easily believe that such a sublime artifice had its origin among barbarous and so inhuman nations. The Greeks, moreover, boasted of poetry which had arisen among them, as Leontius asserts with all his might. Into which credulity I too am drawn a little. I remember that I once heard from a famous preceptor of mine that the ancient Greeks were such a source for this. For when at first, among the still rude men of no superior genius, they had taken by nature to admire the works of their parent, and thence by meditation gradually entered into the credulity, that there was someone, by whose work and rule they were governed and ordered, and that they saw all things, and that they called him one god, then, expecting that he would never inhabit the lands, they thought that it would be holy, that he should come and find passages dedicated to his name, to erect sacred edifices to him, and to build at a very great expense, which we call temples at this day. Hence, in order to propitiate him towards them, they devised certain special honors, to be performed at appointed times, which they called sacred. Finally, since as much as the divinity is supposed to prevail over the others, so much more than the rest should it be honored in the sacred places silver tables and golden vials, candlesticks, and any golden vessels, and from among the wiser and more noble of the people, men, who were afterwards to be called priests, at last, since it seemed absurd for dumb and silent pontiffs to offer sacred things to the deity, they wished to compose words, by which the praises and magnificence of the deity itself might be shown, and the wishes of the people expressed, and the prayers offered to him according to the opportunities of men. And since it would seem incongruous, it is no different than if you were talking to a prefect, or a servant, or a friend of your roommate, to address the divinity, the more prudent will wish that an exquisite way of speaking should be found, which should be devised by the priests, of whom some, but few, whom Muses, Linus, and Orpheus are believed to have been present, moved by a certain divine instigation of the mind, to invent foreign songs regulated by measures and times, and to find praise in God, in which, in order that they might be of greater authority, they placed under the bark of words the lofty mysteries of the gods, desiring, for this reason, that the venerable majesty of such should not be brought into the precipice of contempt because of too much knowledge of the common people. That artifice, since it was seen as wonderful and even unheard of, as we have said, from the effect of calling poetry or poets, which in Latin sounds like an exquisite phrase, and those who composed them were called poets, and since the name also favors the effect, it is believed that poetry had its origin among the Greeks, so that we may omit the song added to the songs and the rest. Much is said about time. For Leontius said that he had often heard such things from Barlaus, his tutor in Calabria, and from other learned men, in the days of Feronius, king of the Argives, who began to reign in the year of the world 3 CCCLXXXV, Museum, whom we said was one of the inventors of poems, was a distinguished man among the Greeks, and flourished about the same time as Linus, of whom the fame is still sufficiently famous, that even among us it is testified that they were sacred prefects of old, and to these also Orpheus has added tracts, and for this reason they are believed to be the first theologians. But Paulus Perusinus said that it was a much younger poem, without changing the authors, asserting that Orpheus, who is written as one of the ancient inventors, was famous in the time of Longin, king of the Trojans, who, in the reign of Eurystheus, king of the Messinus, ruled among the Trojans, about the year 3000 of the world. And that he was Orpheus of the Argonauts, and that he was not only the successor of Muse, but that he was the teacher of the same Muse's son Eeamolchius, which Eusebius also testifies in the Book of Times. From which it is clear, as has been said, poetry is much younger than it is said to be among the Greeks. However, to this Leontius answered that it was supposed by the learned Greeks that there were more Orpheus and Muses, but that he was a Greek contemporary with the old Muse and Linus, where Trax is said to be younger. Of course, since this younger Bacchus invented the orgies and the Maenads at night, and innovated many things about the ancient rituals, and was very effective in speech, of which he was held in great esteem by his contemporaries, Orpheus was the first to be believed by posterity. Perhaps we must adhere to this opinion, since it is established by the testimony of some of the ancients that even before the birth of Jove the Cretans there were no poets, since after the abduction of Europa by Jove it is established by Eusebius that Orpheus Thrace was famous. When, therefore, they are thus at odds with each other, and do not adduce any sufficiently strong evidence from the ancient authors to strengthen their opinions, I am not quite certain to whom I should give credit. It appears, however, from the times recorded, that, if Leontius is to be believed, poetry appeared among the Greeks before among the Hebrews, and if Veneto, among the Chaldeans before among the Greeks. But if we are willing to give Paul faith, it follows that Moses was the teacher of the same before the Babylonians or the Greeks. But however much Aristotle says, perhaps on the basis of the above passage, that the poets were the first theologians, thinking that they understood the Greeks, which seems to bring some support to the opinion of Leontius, I do not believe the sublime effects of this poetry, let us allow in that Bellune and Broth, but not in the Museo, or Lino, or Orpheus, however many of the most ancient poets, unless, as some think, Muses and Moses are one and the same, first infused, so that I think, with nostalgia, that he wrote the greater part of the Pentateuch not in a loose style, but in heroic poetry, dictated by the Holy Spirit. And thus, no others, in any way, have invented the great things of God under the metrical cover of the literary, which we call poetical. Whose footsteps I, and perhaps not insipidly, think the Gentile poets followed in composing poems, but were godly men, full of the Holy Spirit, impelled by him, wrote, so also others with the power of the mind, whence it is said, with this urgent fervor, to compose their poems. But you, illustrious king, since I have nothing else to say about the origin of this man, take what you please from your serene judgment. Nor perhaps insipidly, I think, followed the footsteps of the Gentile poets in composing poems, but were godly men, full of the Holy Spirit, impelled by him, wrote, so also others with the power of the mind, whence it is said, with this urgent fervor, to compose their poems. But you, illustrious king, since I have nothing else to say about the origin of this man, take what you please from your serene judgment. Nor perhaps insipidly, I think, followed the footsteps of the Gentile poets in composing poems, but were godly men, full of the Holy Spirit, impelled by him, wrote, so also others with the power of the mind, whence it is said, with this urgent fervor, to compose their poems. But you, illustrious king, since I have nothing else to say about the origin of this man, take what you please from your serene judgment. Chapter 9. It appears that making up stories is beneficial rather than harmful. They assert, moreover, that these magnificent poets are legendary men, and, as they use the term in a more derogatory or detestable way, they sometimes call them fables in their stomachs. I have no doubt that such an objection will seem to the most ignorant to be execrable, but I am making fluff. He does not have the filth of some tongues to infect the glorious name of illustrious men. I am sorry that seeing these bruised, they bring themselves to be unharmed. But what finally? I grant that the legendary, that is, the composers of fables, are poets. Nor do I consider this dishonorable, except to use a philosopher to form a syllogism, for if it be shown what a fable is, and what kinds of fables there are, and what these fables have used, I think it will not be seen to be so great a joke, as they wish they had founded fables. A fable, therefore, before others, will have its most honorable origin, and from that fable, that sounds nothing but conversation, which is sufficiently demonstrated by Luke in the Gospel, when he writes about the two disciples who, after Christ's passion, went to a fort called Emmaus, saying thus, Christ, approaching, went with them, etc. From this, if it is bad to compose stories, and it will be bad to talk, which is most foolish to admit. For it is not permitted by the nature of things to speak to men so much as to speak to one another, and to communicate concepts through the words of our minds. They might, however, object that this would be granted for convenience, not for superfluity, but that fables are superfluous. This could not be denied if the poet had understood that he had composed a simple fable. But for a long time now it has been shown that it is quite different from what the bark sounds like. Shrouded in fables. And hence it is not customary for anyone to define a fable in this way. A fable is a model or demonstrative expression under a figment, whose bark is removed, the intention of the storyteller is clear. And so, if something tasty is discovered under the veil of legend, it will not be superfluous to publish stories, of which I believe there is a fourfold species, and the first of these completely lacks truth in the bark, as, for example, when we introduce brute or even senseless animals into talking with each other. And the greatest author of these was Aesop, a Greek man venerable in antiquity and also in gravity. And since these were used not only by the civilized common people, but also by the peasants, for the most part, he did not hesitate to insert Aristotle, a man of heavenly genius and the chief philosopher of the Peripatetics, into his books. But this second appearance on the surface will never mix with the mythical truth. As if we were to say that the daughters of Minia, who were spinning and spurring the orgies of Bacchus, were turned into bats, and the sailors of the Acides, plotting a robbery against Bacchus, were made into fishes. And these, from the first, are to be found by the most ancient poets, whom it was a care both divine and human to clothe with figures, and those who followed the more sublime poets, to raise them to the better, assuming that no comedians had corrupted them, caring more for the assent of the lascivious populace than for decency. Species, but the third is more like a story than a fable. The famous poets used this in different ways. For the heroic, no matter how much they seem to be writing hysterics, as Virgil writes of Aeneas tossed about by a storm at sea, and Homer of Odysseus bound to an evil ship, lest he should be drawn away by the song of the sirens, yet they feel far different under the veil than is shown. Moreover, the more honorable comedians, such as Plautus and Terentius, they also use this form of chattering, nothing else beyond the fact that they understood the sounds of literature, yet desiring by their art to describe the manners and words of different people, and in the meantime to teach and make the readers cautious. And if they were not de facto, when they were in communion they could or could be. And let not the objectors be disgusted, for in this particular manner Christ the God used in parables. Indeed, the fourth species has nothing at all on the surface or in the hidden truth, since it is the invention of delirious old men. Of which, if these excellent redactors condemn the first species, which we read in the sacred books, namely, that the wood of the forest had a conversation about establishing himself as a king, it will also come to be condemned. But if the second is rejected, almost every sacred volume of the Old Testament will come to be rejected, which is far from the case, since the writings are seen to proceed at the same pace as the editions of the poets, and this as far as the method of composition is concerned. For, where history is absent, neither cares about the superficial possibility, and what the poet calls fable or fiction, he calls the figure of our theologian. Whether this is so, let the more equine judges see, weighing with a balance the surface of the literary visions of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and other sacred men in poets' later fictions, and if they see discrepancies in the right of covering or uncovering, I will consent to condemnation. If they say that the third, which they cannot, is to be condemned, it will be nothing else than that they have condemned that species of speech, which Christ Jesus, the Son of God, our Savior, most especially used while he was in the flesh, nay, to call it a parable, they do not say an example to anyone, because it is said to be an example. But the fourth is condemned when it seems to be moved from no sufficiently suitable principle, nor to be fenced off by the vote of any art, or due to be brought to the end. I do not make a great deal of it, for they do not agree in anything with the fables of the poets. Let me believe that the narrators think that these poems differ from them in nothing. Now I ask, whether they are going to call the Holy Spirit a fable, or Christ a God, who both publish fables under the same divinity. I will not believe, if they are wise. But I, if it is free to go into a long discourse, would best point out that the diversity of names is not obtrusive, if the qualities of style agree, but let them see for themselves. For in fables, which these men so despise on account of the term, we never read that minds excited by mad fervor were calmed down and reduced to their former meekness. For example, while from Memnius Agrippa, a very serious man, the Roman people, dissident from their fathers, were recalled from the sacred mountain to their country by a story. By the tired stories of famous men, the strength of the greatest souls is constantly restored, which is shown not only by the old example, but by constant ones. For we see that princes, occupied with the greatest affairs, as if taught by the nature of the world, after the lofty dispositions of their kingdoms for the better, in order to revive their weary energies, call together those who refresh their weary spirits with jocular conversation. In fables laboring under the weight of adverse fortune, comfort is never spent, as is seen in Lucius Apuleius. Near whom carried Thess, a noble maiden by her misfortune taken captive by the marauders, lamenting her captivity, was a little refreshed by the fable of the old woman Psyche. We have already seen the attacks on a better crop recalled by the fables of the laziness of the mind. And, to speak of the minors in myself, I heard not long ago the illustrious man James de Sancto Severinus, Count of Tricaritas in Claremont, saying that he had by his father, Robert, the son of King Charles, afterwards the famous King of Jerusalem and Sicily, who was a child of such stupendous temper that not without the greatest demonstrable difficulty did he perceive the first elements of literature, and, when his friends almost all despaired of him in this part, the pedagogue of his genius. The skillful cunning of the rhymer of Aesop's fables was drawn into such a great desire of study and knowledge, that in a short time these liberal arts were not only domesticated to us he had learned the truth, even to the sacred philosophy itself, he would pass with wonderful perspicacity, and that he had made himself such a king that mortals recognized more learned than Solomon on this side of kings. What a lot. Fables are indeed so great so that the unlearned may be amused by their first context, and the geniuses may be exercised about the hidden things of the teachers, and thus they may advance in delight in one and the same lesson. Not therefore with such an erect neck, nauseating with such a fastidious sentence, they vomit their bruises and ignorance on the poets. If they are healthy enough, they first take care of their own charms, rather than trying to obscure the splendor of others with the mists of curses. Let them see, let these censors see, with which and how pernicious they are to excite the laughter of women, they never use the combs. Nauseated by such a tedious sentence, they vomit their bitterness and ignorance on the poets. If they are healthy enough, they first take care of their own charms, rather than trying to obscure the splendor of others with the mists of curses. Let them see, let these censors see, with which and how pernicious they are to excite the laughter of women, they never use the combs. Nauseated by such a tedious sentence, they vomit their bitterness and ignorance on the poets. If they are healthy enough, they first take care of their own charms, rather than trying to obscure the splendor of others with the mists of curses. Let them see, let these censors see, with which and how pernicious they are to excite the laughter of women, they never use the combs. Chapter X. It is foolish to believe that the poets felt nothing under the bark of the stories. There are none of these who are so bold as not to be afraid to say, supported by no authority, that it would be most foolish to think that the most famous poets had supposed any meaning to their fables, but rather that they had made them, no matter how great their powers of eloquence could be, and most likely, while they were believed to be acting in them. From insipid falsehoods for truths. O iniquity of men. O laughable stupidity. O foolish deed. While they depress others, they think they are exalting the ignorant. Who can say, beyond the ignorant, that the poet has made fables empty and empty, having only a shell, in order to show eloquence, as if about true force eloquence cannot be shown. They certainly do not know the opinion of Quintilian, whose greatest orator is of opinion, that no eloquence can stand on falsities. But about this another time. For who, as I come to these, will be so mad and so weak, who, reading in Virgil's Buculi, for he sang as if he were forced by the void, together with no other poems following this sentence, and in the Georgics, that these are a part of the divine mind and drawn with applicatives for this purpose, and in the Aeneid, at the beginning the heavens and the earth and the plains are melting, with appendages, from which the mere juice of philosophy is expressed. That he had led his mother, or that Aeneas, in order to see his father, had ridden to the underworld, without understanding what was hidden under the legendary veil? Who is so unconscious of himself, who, noticing our Dante, who constantly dissolves the connections implicit in sacred theology by wonderful demonstration, does not feel that he is not only a philosopher, but was he a distinguished theologian? And if he thinks this, on what basis will he think that a two-limbed griffin, pulling a chariot on the top of a severe mountain, with 7 candlesticks and as many nymphs associated with him, with the rest of the triumphal parade, to show that he knew how to compose rhymes and fables? Moreover, who will be so mad as to think that the most eminent man and the most Christian, Francis Petrarch, whose life and manners we have seen to be praiseworthy in all holiness, and, God willing, we shall see for a long time, and whom I will not call the redeemer of any one more than time, but whomever we know of the passing atoms of time, that he had spent so many vigils, so many sacred meditations, so many hours, days, and years, as we can rightly imagine spent, if we consider the gravity of his bucolic poetry, if we consider the ornamentation, if the exquisite beauty of his words, so that he imagines a Gaul displaying wreaths at Duranian or Pamphilus and Mysian rebuking each other, and other delirious horse shepherds. No one will agree that he is in good control of himself, and far fewer who have seen that he wrote in a loose style in the book of the solitary life, and in that which he entitled Remedies for Both Fortunes, so that I may omit many others, in which, whatever in moral philosophy can be assumed to be sanctity or insight, is perceived with such majesty of words, that nothing can be said to be fuller, nothing more beautiful, nothing more mature, nothing more holy for the instruction of mortals. I could, moreover, introduce my bucolic poem, the sense of which I am aware of, but I have decided to omit it, because I am not yet worthy enough to be mixed up among the men who perform, and because it is proper to leave the words of others. Let therefore the ignorant flatterers be silent, and let the crowd be silent, if they can. Chapter 11. For the convenience of meditation the poet inhabits the wilderness. I said to these people that they were clamoring, moreover, to say that poets inhabit the country, the mountains, and the woods, because they were incapable of civility and manners. O cowardly race of men, they do not warn, struck with fury, because while they want to approve the truth by falsely voting, they make themselves liars. But I do not only admit that the poets worship the countryside, the woods, and the mountains. Indeed, if they had not said so, I was about to say, and perhaps I have already said, certainly not for the reason which the inflated asserted, namely, that they are not strong in civility. When they are strong the poems are sufficiently testified. If they neglect to pay their allegiance to them, let them turn to the writings of the ancients, read the annals of the philosophers, and have no doubt that they will often find poets used to the friendship and conviction of kings and nobles, as long as it pleased them not to lend themselves to dirty or foolish men. Nor do we lack any occurrences in testimony of this truth. Of course I could, if I wanted to show Euripides the poet of Archelaus, the chamberlain of the Macedonian king, Amnias of Brundus the domestic of the Scipios, Virgil, the close friend of Octavian Caesar. And if the old ones are dirty, the present ones are not lacking. Ardantes had a great friendship with Frederick of Aragon, king of the Sicilies, and with Cani della Scala, the magnificent lord of Verona. We know, moreover, and it is well known throughout the world, that Francis Petrarch was the most beloved and familiar of Charles the Emperor, of John, king of the Franks, and of Robert, king of Jerusalem and Sicily, and of many supreme pontiffs, and will live as long as he wishes. But if they do not know these whispers, it is for this reason that they inhabit deserts and worship the poet, because not in the Cupidian form, not in praetoriums, not in theaters, not in capitals or streets, or public places facing, or mixed with civic tumults, or, surrounded by little women, the meditation of lofty things is lent, without which almost constant poems can neither be perceived nor completed. What else? I can scarcely believe that they would have said these things, if they had read in their right mind what Radius Florus writes, who, after having enumerated in his elegant manner some of the impediments of the cities, says, inquiringly, in Rome, do you not think it possible to write poems amidst cares and labors? Willing for this reason, to be understood, not at all possible. Nor was he content with these, added to the other inconvenience, by which the states are continually agitated, as if moved, he said, one now, and towards thee I sing to meditate. As if to say, you will not be able, and finally the seeker added, do you want to sing among the noises of night and day, and follow the footsteps of the void? Not much later he adds indignantly, am I worthy here to stir the sound of the lyre's moving words in the midst of the city's waves and storms? From which, so that I may not add more, it is sufficiently evident why the poet seeks and inhabits wild places. We read that even Paulus the hermit, Antonius, Macarius, Arsenius, and many other venerable and most holy men, were made not for want of civility, but that they might serve God with a freer spirit. Let it not be so detestable, as they seem to think, to dwell in forests, when in them there is nothing false, nothing disguised, nothing harmful to the mind, indeed, all works are simple by nature. There the beeches and other trees rose up to the sky, and by their opacity cast fresh shadows. There the soil was covered with verdant grass and distinguished by flowers of 1,000 colors, clear springs, and silvery streams, declining with a pleasant murmur from the abundance of the mountains. There, picture the birds singing and the leaves resonating with the gentle movement of the ear, playing with the beast. There the flocks and herds, there the shepherd's house, or the shack, no domestic concern, and everything full of tranquility and silence. That not only, by satiating their eyes and ears with their delights, they soothe the mind, but gather the true mind within themselves, and restore the intellect, if it may be tired, to strength, and seem to impel it into a desire for sublime meditation and an eagerness to compose, which with a wonderful exhortation the placid company of the little books and the chorus of the muses dancing around the singers. If we consider all these things properly, what studious man does not prefer deserts to states? Certainly not the crime of loneliness of the poets, even if it can be called a crime with merit. He warns these insolent men to rebuke, lest their mind be infected by a damnable embitterment, from which they say that the poets who disagree are execrable men. For it is the habit of condemned men to desire most of all that others should be conformed to them, that they may cover up or defend themselves from their own crime. Let them therefore be ashamed and be silent, if they do not act like poets. For they frightfully and detestably lead handsome men to disfigure their faces with a false pallor, and to sweep the cities with constant circumambulation at a slow pace. They are horrified and refuse to buy favors and praises from the inert and ugly hypocrites of the common people, and to be pointed at by the ignorant. They are afraid not to expose the bundles, but to beg, to go around the halls of kings, or to become the assent of any nobles, to buy pontiffs with gold, so that they may indulge more widely in the leisure of their bellies and idlers, to flatter women so that they withdraw deposits, to ask for money, which they could not ask for by merit. Moreover, they are horrified and abhorred by the whole affection of the people of Qatar for the sake of raising money to the heavens, and next to the gifts, you set out to present them the amount. Nay, those whom these blaspheme, being content with meager food and short sleep, with continual observation and laudable exercise in composing and writing, seek for themselves a famous glory which will last forever. O this species to be marred by the insults of men, O detestable solitude of such. But what do you mean by words? Indeed, I would have much to say, that neither the spectacular candor, nor the excellent virtue, nor the praiseworthy life of the illustrious poets would defend itself against such with a far stronger strength. By continuous speculation and laudable practice in composing and writing, they seek for themselves a famous glory that will last through the ages. O this species to be marred by the insults of men, O detestable solitude of such. But what do you mean by words? Indeed, I would have much to say, that neither the spectacular candor, nor the excellent virtue, nor the praiseworthy life of the illustrious poets would defend itself against such with a far stronger strength. By continuous speculation and laudable practice in composing and writing, they seek for themselves a famous glory that will last through the ages. O this species to be marred by the insults of men, O detestable solitude of such. But what do you mean by words? Indeed, I would have much to say, that neither the spectacular candor, nor the excellent virtue, nor the praiseworthy life of the illustrious poets would defend itself against such with a far stronger strength. Chapter 12. The obscurity of the poets is not to be condemned. The satirists say that these poems are always obscure, and that this is the vice of poets, that of agents, so that what is inextricable may appear to be more artificially composed, and this they wish to have done, unmindful of the commandment of ancient orators, that the speech should be plain and lucid. O perverse judgment of the mind! For who would ever turn a treacherous soul into such a nefarious thought, that what is inaccessible to him, he not only hates, but, if he can, disfigures it with false accusations? I confess that poets are never obscure, but let them, if they will, give themselves an answer, whether the philosophers, with whose number they mingle themselves with their impudent mouth, find the context so plain, so transparent, that they say they ought to proceed with the speech. If they asserted, they would be lying, since between the writings of Plato and Aristotle, to say nothing of the rest, there are so many entanglements, that not until examined by many perspicacious men from their age to this day, they could be explained quite clearly by a unanimous opinion. But what do I say about philosophers? Is not the divine speech, of which they themselves wish to be regarded as professors, uttered by the Holy Spirit, full of obscurities and ambiguities? Indeed it is, and if they deny it, the manifest truth itself will approve, and the witnesses are many. Among whom, if you please, they may ask Augustine, a most holy and learned man, and whose genius was so great that he could teach many arts in whatever of the 10 categories to the philosopher, without, as he himself admits, perceived as a preceptor, and yet he was not ashamed to confess that he was a say he failed to understand the principle. Obscurities, then, do not exist only in poems. Why, then, do they not accuse philosophers of being poets? What does the Holy Spirit say about his works? To appear more artistic, to have implied obscure views? As if he were not the master of all sublime things. I have no doubt that such rashness is in them, that they would do it, even if they did not know that they were the defenders of the philosophers, and that punishments were prepared for those who spoke against the Holy Spirit, and this they leap upon the poets in a circus, because they see them as lacking a defender, thinking moreover that there would be no fault there, where the penalty does not immediately follow. They ought to have seen, that nothing dark is seen, when they are very clear, by the vice of the beholder. Indeed, with the squint of the shining sun, which is clear, the air appears hazy, that something else of his nature is so profound, that it is not without difficulty that even an excellent intellect can penetrate into their secret, just as in the sphere of the sun, before they can touch it, the most perceptive eyes are never opened. Some truth in it by their nature they are perhaps lucid, they are so veiled by the artifice of pretenders, that it is scarcely possible for anyone to extract the true sense from them with their genius, so that even the most learned astrologers, always buried among the clouds, the great body of the sun, in which part of the sky it wanders, can grasp by the glance of the eyes. And I am not infected with the fact that the poems are never empty. But it is not because of this, as these would like, that they should be condemned by law, since among other duties it is a poet's duty not to eviscerate things cloaked in fictions, take away and if they are able to do what concerns them, they will come not to curse, but rather to commend the poet. And therefore, as has already been said, I confess that they are never obscure, but always extricable. If a healthy understanding approaches them, but I think that these complaints are the eyes of the night rather than human. And let no one think that the truths of the poets are envious of the fictions, or that they wish to deny to the readers the meaning of the hidden altogether, or that they may appear more artificial, but that, having been attached to them, they make dearer what they have attached, but what they have discovered by the labor of genius, and understood in different ways, becomes dearer. That the Holy Spirit has done far more for everyone who has a sound mind must be considered as most certain. This seems to be confirmed by Augustine in the book Silstes Jerusalem 11. And elsewhere Augustine says the same thing on Psalm 66, therefore, perhaps, it is placed more obscurely, so that the understanding may beget many. And let men depart richer who have found it closed, that it may be opened in many ways, than if they had found it open in one way. And that I may use the testimony of the same Augustine further against the recalcitrants, so that they may feel that, as he defends the obscurities of the sacred literature, I would like to be understood as the obscurities of the poems. I say that he writes on Psalm 60 as follows, there is nothing perverse here, but there is something dark. Not that it should be denied to you, but that he should practice receiving it, etc. And, lest I use more extensive testimony of holy men about this, I do not want them to be disgusted to hear it, since I would like the same to be felt about the obscurities of the poets, which is felt about the divine by Augustine, nay, that, having rubbed their foreheads a little, I would have the objectors consider how much more should be thought of these things, which are applied to relatively few, if of the sacred books, which are felt by all nations. If perhaps they would have condemned the hardness of the text, the figures of speech, or the colors of the orations, and the beauty unknown to them of foreign words, and hence called the poets obscure, what else can I say, except that the grammarians should repeat the schools again, the pedagogues should undergo the rod, study, and learn, what by the authority of the ancients, a license was given to such poets, and they are scrupulously scrutinized, beyond the vulgar and domestic, even if they are foreign. But what do you insist on? I could have said to a few, let them act so that, putting off the old, they put on a new and noble character, and what seems to them now obscure, will then appear familiar and open. And let them not think that they are covering up the indigestible grossness of their understanding by the precept of the ancient orators, of which there is no doubt that the poets were always mindful, but let them warn since the order of words proceeds in a different way in persuasion than in inventing, and fictions would be left to the discretion of the inventor as the work of another species, in which the majesty of the style is preserved above all by the poets, and the dignity of the same is retained, as Francis Petrarch says, Contra Medicum, Book of Invectives 3. Nor, as they themselves seem to think, is he ended those who are unable to gather, but, having been entrusted with sweet labor, he is at the same time consulted for pleasure and memory, for they are dearer, which we have sought with difficulty, and are kept with exactness, as Francis testifies to the same, whereabove. What a lot. If they have a dull wit, let them not reproach the poets for their indolence, nor insist against them with frivolous barks, by whom they have been well treated. For at first, at the threshold, lest the ignorant should tire in vain, terror was injected from the very face of things, therefore let them retrace a step in time, rather than let them suffer a repulse with a blush, as they marched on with fatigued torpor of their wits. And as I said again, those who want to understand and to unravel ambiguous connections must read, insist, and watch, and question, and in every way press the powers of the brain. And if a man cannot reach what he desires by one way, he must enter another, and if obstacles stand in the way, he must take another, until, if he is strong enough, light appears to him, which at first seemed dark. For we are forbidden by the divine admonition to give holy things to dogs, and by the same to cast pearls before swine. Until, if strength be strong, light appears to him, which at first seemed dark. For we are forbidden by the divine admonition to give holy things to dogs, and by the same to cast pearls before swine. Until, if strength be strong, light appears to him, which at first seemed dark. For we are forbidden by the divine admonition to give holy things to dogs, and by the same to cast pearls before swine. Chapter 13. Poets are not liars. Moreover, insulting liars, they say that they are poets, and they try to establish this point with strong arguments, if they can, saying, as it has been said, that they write lies in their fables, like a man turned to stone, which appears to be completely contrary to the truth. Moreover, they asserted that the poets falsely say that there are many gods, when it is confirmed by the most certain truth that there is only one, and that true and omnipotent, adding that Virgil, the chief of the Latin poets, recited a less true story of Dido, and also inserted something else of this kind. I believe they think they have won, and would have won, were it not for the fact that there was someone who would resound their insipid cries with truth. What then? Rebar has sufficiently answered this question in the previous place, while I have described quite extensively what a fable is, how many kinds of fables there are, and which poets have used, and for what reason. But if we must return to this matter again, I say that the poets, as they like, are not liars. For a lie, in my opinion, is a fallacy very similar to the truth, by which the truth is suppressed by no one, and is expressed, which is falsity. Augustine asserts that there are 8 species of this, of which, and if there are none more serious than the rest, yet we can use none knowingly without the mark of sin and infamy, by which we are said to be liars. If the enemies of the poet's name look at the intent of this definition with an equal mind, they will know that this restatement, by which they assert that liars are poets, lacks force, since the fictions of poets do not adhere to any species of falsehood, because it is not in their mind to deceive anyone by pretending, nor, as it is a lie, poetic fictions, for the most part, are not at all similar, but neither similar to the truth, nay, very discordant and contrary. And given that one kind of fable, which we have said to be seen rather as a story than a fable, is most similar to the truth, it is immune from the corruption of lies by the most ancient agreement of all nations, since it is the custom of old to grant that one may use it by reason of an example, in which the simple truth is not sought, and lying is not forbidden. And if we look at the duty of the poets, as has never been demonstrated in the previous works, they are not bound by this bond, to use the truth on the surface of fictions, and if the license to wander through every kind of fiction is taken away from them, their duty is completely dissolved into nothing. What more? If all that has been said is thrown into merited censure, which I do not think is possible, this remains irreproachable, no one exercising his rightful office can be infamous for this. Reader, let it be in law that the capital punish the ill-deserved, he is not, however, called a murderer by law, so neither is a soldier, a ravager of the enemy's fields, called a prey, nor does a lawyer, even if he gives less advice to a client, as long as he does not depart from the limits of the law, deserve the mark of a falsifier, so also the poet, no matter how much he lies by pretending, does not incur the disgrace of a liar, when he executes his duty most justly, not to deceive, but to pretend. If, however, they wish to make an insistence on this, that it is not true, it is a lie, no matter how it is said, if it is not done, I will not, however, add any further strength to the internalization of this objection, but I will complain, to see what they will answer, and by what name they should be called. That which, through John the Evangelist in the Apocalypse, is wonderful with the majesty of the senses, but is always at first sight inconsistent with the truth. Whereas John himself, in which one and the other who will cover the great things of God with the same style. Indeed, I would not dare to tell lies or liars, even if it were permitted. I know, however, that they will say that I myself am going to say in part, if I ask, that John and the other prophets were most truthful men, which has already been granted. Moreover, they will add that the writings by them are not fictions, but rather are figures, and should be so called, and consequently the figures are the same writers. The laughable refuge, as if we were to believe that what is very similar in the bark, a change, or diversity of name should produce different effects. But in this there is less of a question, they are figurative, whether they have any truth in their literal bark, let them express it, I beseech them. If they want me to believe this, it will be nothing else than a lie to cover the eyes of my understanding, as they cover the supposed truth. Of course, since these liars are not to be said or held, because they are not, so neither are the poets, who for their strength rely on traces in their creation. Now that the poets wrote of many gods, since there is only one God, it cannot be denied, but they are by no means imputed to them as lying, because they wrote neither believing nor affirming, but pretending after their manner. For who is so ignorant of himself, as to think that everyone who is engaged in the lore of philosophy is of such a mad opinion, as to believe that there are as many gods as possible? If we are sane enough, we should easily believe that learned men were the most diligent seekers after truth, and that they reached as far as the human intellect can penetrate, and that they knew without ambiguity that there was only one God, to which knowledge their poets came to be clearly perceived in their works. Read Virgil, and you will find him praying, Jupiter Almighty, if you bow down to any prayer, etc. that you will find no epithet of the gods given to another. But he thought that the rest of the multitude of the gods were not gods, but members of God, or offices of the divinity, as Plato, whom we call a theologian, also thinks. and to such, for the veneration of the divinity, to give a name in accordance with the duty of the deity. But I do not think that these enemies will be appeased by these. They will cry out, saying that the poets have written many lies about the true God and the only one whom we say they knew, and for that reason they should be called liars. But I do not doubt that the Gentile poets felt less correctly about the true God, and thus never wrote about him that had been less true, and thus, as they want, a lie. But for that reason I do not think that they should be said to be liars. For there are at least two kinds of men's lies, of which the first lie knowingly and knowingly, in order to injure, or not to injure, or to profit. And these are not only to be called liars, but by a more proper term liars. The second are those who, not knowing that they are telling a lie, nevertheless tell a lie. And between these a convenient distinction falls. For there are some of these whose ignorance is intolerable, and does not accept any excuse, as, for example, it is to be observed by the public law, that no citizen should keep a private citizen in prison. Gaius Sempronius detained his debtor, and he wishes to be protected from much ignorance of the law, which, since it seems supine and coarse, that is to say, a citizen ignorant of the public laws, cannot defend against harm. Even so, a Christian man should not be protected from ignorance of the articles of the faith at any age. There are also others whose ignorance seems to be excused, such as children if they do not know philosophy, a mountain man if he does not know navigation, and a man born blind if he does not know the letters of letters, and the like. Among whom may be numbered the Gentile poets, who, even if they knew the liberal arts, if they knew poetry, if they knew philosophy, could not have known the truth of the Christian religion. For that light of truth had not yet shone eternally on the earth, which illuminates every person who comes into this world, not yet had they gone over the world inviting to the Lamb's Supper, calling whomever they might. This gift was given from above to the Israelites alone, that they might know the true and just God and worship him properly. Not only did they invite anyone to share with them in such a celebrated feast, but they did not even admit those who approached, if they were foreigners. And so, if those who felt less true wrote about the true God, thinking that they were writing the truth, excused by this acceptable ignorance, they are not to be called liars. They will say, I know that whatever ignorance is a lie, he is a liar when he says that it cannot be denied. Let it not be the same note that he allows to be undermined, who through ignorance is excusable to sin, as he who is thick and supine, as has been said, when you not only read them, but also have the austerity of the laws excused, and if so, they do not incur the mark of lying. And if they want them to lie in any way at all, I will add to them the philosophers Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and others whom they highly revere, and they will be accused of the same crime. These excellent censors, I think, will again raise their voices to heaven, playing on the psaltery and the lyre, since it does not appear that one part of this objection has been sufficiently rejected. O insipid, if the arm of one soldier is broken, not while the entire line has been moved from its place, therefore let them not exult, but let them remember that they have been very badly bruised and unwilling to quit. But what they charge against Virgil is false. Indeed, a prudent man would not recite the story of Dido, for he knew as the most learned of such, that Dido was a woman of great honor, and that he had rather die by his own hand than to infect his pious breast with chastity for the purpose of second marriages. But, in order to obtain the artifice and poetical veil which was convenient for his work, he composed a story in many respects similar to Dido's history, which, as was said a little before, is granted to the old institution of the poet. However, someone worthy of an answer, and perhaps you yourself, Prince, could inquire, why was this necessary for Virgil? In order that a worthy answer may be given to him, I say that in this he was drawn from a fourfold reason. First, that in the style which he had adopted in the Aeneid, he should follow the manner of poetry, and above all that of Homer, of whom he was an imitator in that poem. For poets do not, as historians do, who begin their work from a definite principle, and with a continuous and orderly description of the events they bring down to the end, which we see that Lucan did, for which reason many consider him a metrical historiographer rather than a poet, but they begin with a far greater artifice, either about the middle of the history, or sometimes almost near the end, which they intend and they discover to themselves a reason for reciting what they seem to have omitted from the previous ones, as in the Odyssey Homer, who, as if towards the end of Odysseus' errors, writes that he was brought shipwrecked to the shore of Theus, and there recites to King Alcinous whatever had happened to him before that day after his departure from Troy, which Virgil wished to do, when he had written of Aeneas fleeing from the shore of Troy after the freed city. He did not find a more suitable place to which to bring him, before entering Italia, on the African shore, for up to that time he had always sailed among the enemies of the Greeks. And when the coast of Afram was for a time inhabited by rustics and barbarous people, he led him to a person worthy of veneration, and received water, and at whose exhortation he recited the events of the Trojans in his own, and no other than Dido, who, and if not then, many yet after centuries it is believed that he inhabited those places. Finding Dido, as if he had already arrived, he made him his guest, and, as we read, recited his misfortunes and his misfortunes at his command. Secondly, that which is hidden under the veil of poetry, Virgil intends throughout the work to show by what passions human frailty is attacked, and by what powers a steadfast man overcomes them. And since he had no longer shown any, wishing to demonstrate the causes by which we are carried away from the concupiscible appetite into lasciviousness, he introduces Dido, bright by the nobility of blood, young in age, handsome in form, remarkable in character, abounding in riches, famous for chastity, circumspect in prudence and eloquence, commanding his state and people, and a widow, as if from the experience of Venus more apt to lust. All these noble things tend to irritate the spirit of any man, let alone exiles and shipwrecked people, and cast into an unknown country and in need of support. And so he intends for Dido a concupiscible and attractive power, armed with all opportunities. But Aeneas for whatever is fit to slip and finally seize. At last he showed us the way in which we are lured into crime and the way in which we are brought back to virtue. By whom Virgil feels, or is properly bitten by conscience, or the remonstrance of a friend and an eloquent man, by whom, sleeping in the mire of shame, we are awakened, and recalled to the right and beautiful path, that is, to glory. And then we unhappily break the bond of entertainment, when, armed with strength, we reject flattery, tears, prayers, and such like, which draw them to the contrary, with a steadfast mind, and leave them behind. Thirdly, in his praises of Aeneas, Virgil takes care to emphasize the race of the Julius Caesar in honor of Octavian Caesar, which he accomplishes, while he shows him trampling on the lasciviousness and filthiness of the flesh and feminine delights with the strength of his mind. Fourthly, he intends to exalt the glory of the Roman name, which he does sufficiently, while he describes the execrations of Dido's death. For by them are meant the wars of the Carthaginians with the Romans and the triumphs which the Romans obtained from them, in which the name Roman is sufficiently emphasized. Chapter 14. Stupidity is condemned, which is of course less understood. Moreover, they want and cry out, blaspheming the name of poetry, that the poems of the poets should be entirely abolished, because they are full of loose ways and the rubbish of the heathen gods, nor is it in any way tolerable, that many should be attributed to one and the same god in form and names, as the poet does to his Jupiter or to others. Our adversaries enter the battle after the manner of foolish soldiers, who are carried away by the rush of harming their enemies so much that they do not see for themselves, from which offense is made, so that those who prepare a blow against another, he himself receives unarmed. I, however, thought that a sufficient answer to these objections, gathered together in one envelope, had been given in the foregoing, in which I remember very carefully written under various forms, lascivious, and toy, and under the names of honest and tasteful closed senses, which I also remember to have opened for the strength of my character, having removed the legendary bark. But the acts of the gods of the Gentiles in any way described by the poets, especially by the comedians, I neither praise nor commend them, but rather detest them. It is indeed a very large field of imagination, and poetry always treads the horn of fictions, therefore they did not fail in any sense of the most respectable coverings. Of course, this complaint has long since been withdrawn and dormant. For once upon the stages and theaters by mimes and actors and parasites and men of this sort, they sang inordinately, that they utterly removed and reprobated the ancient Romans, as Cicero testifies, and condemned the stage itself in the art of play, and censured the actors, and removed them from the tribes. Thus it was also provided by the edict of the priests, that those who appeared on the stage for the sake of making a ludicrous statement of art, would automatically be considered infamous. Moreover, after Constantine Caesar and the Pontiff Sylvester, springing up on every side and increasing day by day, the Catholic faith, the poems of such comedians or dramatists paid off from the century, and there remained the illustrious and laudable books and essays of poets, who described events and natural events in a more august style, with an artifice scheme, with a more eloquent speech under an appropriate they brought forth under the cover of fictions and images. And so, those whom the demigod Plato had ordered to be driven out of the city, and against whom these people who are ignorant of the truth cry out, have already been exterminated and driven away. It is true that some of the objections of our answerers may be answered on the other hand. Ethereal fire, now eagle now man, or in what better forms were described by the poets, they would wonder if they remembered the very true and only God, now the sun, now fire, now a lion, now a serpent, now a lamb, now a worm, now even a stone described by the saints. And in the same way our most venerable mother the church is sometimes called a woman clothed with the sun, sometimes a woman clothed in many things, sometimes a car, sometimes a ship, sometimes an ark, a house, a temple, and so on. I remember reading it very well. About the complexity of the names, what I have to say, I have the same. Almost innumerable among our people are attributed to God, and as many to the Virgin Mary and to the Church, and these were not done without mystery, as they did not even to the poet. What, then, are they roaring without noticing? They would not stand still, pushing. Chapter 15 It is hateful to judge too much of strangers. Moreover, these zealous advocates of crimes affirm the poets. If they had distinguished themselves in this accusation, perhaps I would have conceded that they were the victors. For it is quite certain that there have been no dishonest comedians for some time now, either by their wicked wit so persuasive, or so by the corrupt inquisitiveness of that time, and not even Nason Pellinus, a poet of renown, but of a lascivious genius, who lovingly composed a book of art, in which, even if many mischievous things are suggested, nothing is less opportune, since there is no young man or simple girl so mad in this storm, that, moved by the alluring appetite of the mind, far, so, that he may come to what he desires, he does not know how to teach more acutely than he who thought himself to be such a preeminent preceptor. If, therefore, these, whom we said we would never throw away, had preserved the honesty of their poetic ability, what others, I saw with splendid honesty, that this charge deserves to be branded, and to be accused together with the wretched? Indeed, it is not to be tolerated. And for this reason, in order that it may be clear why the illustrious are accused by these, let them say whether they have ever read the poem of Homer, whether of Hesiod, of Virgil, of Orestius, of Juvenal, and of many others of this kind, and, if they admit that they have read it, let them express why they found these suggestions of crimes, so that, seeing for themselves, what we have not yet seen, we may condemn with them the ill-deserved. However, it is unnecessary to ask. But who, having heard the accusation, will not perceive, because they have never read it, when we must clearly believe that if they had seen it, they would not have come to such a foolish opinion. I judge, however, from such a question that these crimes will be added to the crime, for they are unable to keep silent, they are held in such terror, lest by reason of their silence they should be thought to know all things any less, and they shall say with a raised face, speaking with all their mouths, and with a blush removed from every forehead, as if they came from this very praise, why do we see these toys? Woa! We have not seen, and we do not wish to have seen, we are paying attention to the elders. Oh good God, if you wanted to take a break from your eternal work in the summer, you could, and if the eyes of your divinity were willing, you could go to sleep, if you wanted, these will take care of your business. They spend sleepless nights on you, they spend their sweat on you. Indeed, I think that they should move mobile first, while they are serving the elders. It is great, it is a lot, and if you allow it, it is a worthy work. Oh, the lazy minds of men, they do not notice, while they so wisely deceive others, that they wretchedly expose their own ignorance. Indeed, if we are not more foolish than they, we can sufficiently see how just their accusation is, how wholly intolerable their sentence. Of course, let it not be thought that I am predicting this future answer from a frivolous meditation, I confess, since in this I draw from a most certain conjecture. For some time now I have heard of no one answering a similar question even more vehemently, and, what was more serious to me, a certain man, venerable in age and sanctity, and in other respects eminent in learning, did not answer, but of his own motion spoke far more vehemently. I do not lie, God knows, the king is famous. It was, as it seemed at the time, that this man was so hostile to the enemy of the poetic name, that he seemed to utter it only in a stomach-churning way, which he showed where it was less convenient for his honor. For one morning in our general study, reading in the chair the Gospel of John to a large audience, when by chance his name happened to be mentioned, his face lit up, his eyes flaming, and his voice higher than usual, all the while tearing into the poets, he said many extraordinary things, and lastly, that his justice might appear, he said, and almost confirmed it with an oath, that he had neither seen, nor ever wanted to see, any of the poets' books. O holy God! What will the ignorant say, if another learned man, weighty in years and with authority, spoke thus? Could he not speak more foolishly than a madman? I would like to know, if they did not see, if they did not know, if these excellent censors are vacating the elders, how do they recognize the poets as instigators of crimes? Why are the strangers barking around them? Why do not the judges of the Edens mount the platform to pass judgment on the unknown? What, not only unheard of, but not even required part of the sentence is to thunder. Perhaps they will say that the Holy Spirit inspired them to impose such a severe decree on the poets. I would say it was possible, if I believed that the Holy Spirit not only dwells in such impure souls, but enters them. O impious crime, O abominable evil, O abominable rashness, that a blind man should dare to give an opinion about colors in the firstborn. Once upon a time I have heard that Pharonius among the Argives, Lycurgus among the Lacedaemonians, Minos among the Cretans, and among the Myrmidons were wont to worship him as these princes do. But, to come to the point where the mind leads, whatever these reverend judges may blare, they are not, as they wish, poets inciting crimes. Nay, if their volumes are read with a sound mind and not with a maddened ruse, one will find the most gentle and now the most ardent instigators, according to the exigencies of the time, to the virtues. Lest it appear that I have proved it with so few words, I would like to place at least a few before the eyes of those who are clamoring, from which they may, if they wish, recognize this truth. And, omitting the admonitions of Homer, who is less familiar to the Latins because of the Greek literature, if they wish, they should read the exhortations of Aeneas to his comrades in the Aeneid for the patience of emerging labors. What kind of ardor was he through the wounds of death for the safety of his country, that piety towards his father, whom he carried on his shoulders through burning houses and falling temples on every side, and through the midst of enemies and 1,000 flying weapons to safety, that mercy on the Achaemenid enemy, that strength of mind to mock and break the fetters of love, what justice and munificence towards friends and strangers in presenting well-deserved gifts, the games performed on the anniversary of Anchises' father at Assists, what prudence, what circumspection in the descent to the underworld, what persuasions to glory from the begotten towards him, what his enjoining friendship skill, with what great kindness and faith in preserving them. How pious in the death of Belanti's friend, with tears, which he constantly warned his son. What should I report? Let them, I pray thee, let them roar at the name of poetry, read the words of this poet, let them weigh the opinions, and, if the mind permits, express the fruit from them that is possible, and, if it pleases God, they will see whether the poet here is an instigator of a bad harvest. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. If the mind permits, let them express fruit from these things that they can, and, if it pleases God, they will see whether the poet here is an instigator of a bad harvest. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. If the mind permits, let them express fruit from these things that they can, and, if it pleases God, they will see whether the poet here is an instigator of a bad harvest. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. If it will be pleasing to God, they will see whether the poet here is an instigator of a bad harvest. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. If it will be pleasing to God, they will see whether the poet here is an instigator of a bad harvest. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. Indeed, if Virgil had properly known and worshipped God, almost nothing would have been read in the volume beyond his saint. And if they say that the laws do not suffer anything to be approved by the testimony of one, let them take in addition Flaccus of Venus, Persius of Volterra, and Aquinas of Juvenal, whose satirical poetry is driven into vices and vices with such force of virtue that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. Juvenal Aquinas, whose satirical poem is attacked with such force of virtue against vices and vices that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. Juvenal Aquinas, whose satirical poem is attacked with such force of virtue against vices and vices that it seems to exterminate them. If these others, then, are sufficiently numerous, let those who accuse the poets of inciting crimes be silent, and tame their rage with meekness, and not disdain to learn, before they are willing to judge the labors of others with laughter, lest, while they hurl at others the weapons of their foolish iniquity, they may take upon themselves the divine vengeance they will provoke lightning. Chapter 16 That the poets lead themselves into good reading. After this they say that the most earnest poets are seducers of minds, because with sweet poetry, pleasant speech, precise and ornate speech, they insinuate their follies on their readers, and thus, in the least convenient way, they seduce the insipid readers. Who is ignorant, and who has not seen the poets, as the objectors themselves are ignorant, and has not seen the poets illustrious, and, if they have seen, they have not understood the weakness of their talents, will not believe that it is easy to introduce them into a poetic poem in the best, just, and holy way. Let God see this, and let those who have been granted the light of understanding by him see it. And you, the celestial zitherist, David, accustomed to calm the fury of Saul with the sweetness of a song, if you have sung something sweet, if you have sung a melodious song, hide the lyric of your song. And you, Job, who have written your labors in patience in heroic meter, if it is beautiful, if it is decorated, do the same, together with other holy men, who sing divine mysteries in ethereal verse, and, what I say to these, let it be said to Orpheus, Homer, Maron, Flaccus, and others, after it had come to that they should be found who say with impunity, that it is to seduce men's minds by pouring out dulcet, witty, and accurate metrical speeches. Obey by and you, me by, let them in, after these are condemned, a time, which I did not need at all, has been granted to you, and a very large place has been prepared. I know, they will say that he said that he had written a poem and read it in a sonorous manner. This edition was, I confess, of no small importance, had it not been shown many times in the preceding, what they are, which they accuse, of the folly of the illustrious poets, and because of what they considered the most important, it was resolved into nothing. However, to come more directly into this, because they say that they are poets who deceive minds, I would first like to know that since there are many of these who are poets, who are the deceivers of minds. And who doubts? They cannot say anything beyond those whom they study. But whom they should study, the accusation itself shows. If it pleases God, these zealous men love, court, and applaud the smiling women with their eyes. From here the volumes of Catullus, Propertius, and Naso unfold, and by the foolish persuasions of such, by the beautifully described poems, and the easily embellished context of words, as if in this whole bent breast, the willing are drawn, seduced, and held, hence to know the charms of the poets, hence the ungrateful preceptors accuse their own, and call them seducers of minds, whom they themselves, without being asked, followed of their own free will. Great, then, nay, the very greatest of our slanderers, for it is no small thing to submit to love, by whose strength first Phoebus, and then Alcides, the tamers of monsters, cease. Oh, how much better the ignorant would have kept silent, than to have uttered words to his shame. For if they look forward, while they have accused the poets, they will notice that they themselves have been shown to be guilty, for from this accusation we clearly know what their interests are, what their desires are, and what their justice is. For what can we judge of these, if a girl, with lascivious gestures, petulant eyes, and flattering words, promises an unfortunate prospect, after they have been seduced by mute or silent songs? Let the wretched men therefore be ashamed, and reform their foolish plan for the better, and see that Odysseus, a Gentile man, despised not the mute songs, but the melodious songs of the sirens, as noxious, and passed away. And, so that something was said about the force of the word, which the poets object to as detestable, they ought to have seen, because even if Christ, our Saviour, was objected to by the Jews, who shamefully called him a seducer, yet he would not always be taken on the wrong side. For it is impossible that those abusing, strange men have stolen the old power, for he can sometimes lead them astray to the good side, for they are skillful shepherds who take care of the shepherding of the infected herds, not while they have seduced the infected oxen with disease. And thus learned men have never seduced noble minds by their advice from those who suffer from the disease of vices. Why, I think, should the most illustrious poets seduce the credulous, and make them better, when these, having been seduced by their own tricks, and not by the crime of even less honorable poets, try to show, if they can, a bad harvest. O good Jesus! Chapter 17 Philosophers say that apes are by no means poets. Besides the monkeys and the philosophers, none of these who prefer themselves to the rest say that they are poets. But I am not quite certain, whether to make men laugh, as they never do with their little women, or rather from the opinion of their hearts, because they believe so, or from the wickedness of their minds, that they may laugh at them. First of all, it ought to be tolerated by the wise with an indignant spirit, while they saw the ridiculous things being done by men who were ignorant of the common people, when here and there in the trifle streets stuffed donkeys and butchered pigs, and, from that favorite breed, belugas, fringed and not, and dressed in various skins, were found marching easily, from which anyone who wished could more decently confine such things. But if the believers assert, or mock, they both act as foolishly as they do not. For it is in the apes, as we remember that others have said, that this is usually inculcated by nature, so that they will, while they can, seeing that any actions of men are imitated, and so it seems that these poets want to be imitators, and hence philosophers are monkeys. That would not be funny at all, indeed, for the most part, honest men were philosophers and discoverers of the good arts. But the uneducated are deceived, for if they understood sufficiently the poems of the poets, they would notice that they are not apes, but that they are reckoned from the very number of philosophers, since nothing beyond the consonants of philosophy, according to the ancient beliefs, is covered with a veil of fable. Moreover, a simple imitator in no way departs from the footsteps of the imitated. This, indeed, is not at all seen in the poets, for, be it from the philosophers, it does not become conclusions, yet they do not tend towards them in the same way. The philosopher, as is clear enough, syllogizingly rejects what he considers less true, and in the same way approves what he intends, and this as openly as he can. The poet, what he conceived by meditating under the veil of fiction, completely removed from syllogisms, he hides as artfully as possible. The philosopher was wont to write in a prosaic style, as he often did, and almost despised his ornament, a metrical poet, with the utmost care and exquisite decorum. Philosophers, moreover, are to debate in the gymnasiums, to sing of poets in solitude. And when these things do not agree with each other, he will not be, as they say, a simian poet of philosophers. If they said that they were apes by nature, it might perhaps be tolerated with a more equine spirit, since instead of strength, whatever it is, whatever its works are perpetually working, the famous poet tries to describe in a poem. But if they wish to look, they will see the forms, manners, speech, and actions of all living beings, the paths of the heavens and the stars, the crash and rush of the winds, the crackling of flames, the sound of the waves, the heights of the mountains, and the shadows of the forests and the movements of the rivers are so aptly described, that they themselves are thought to be contained in small volumes of poetry. In this I will confess that poets are apes, for I think it is a most honorable work, namely, to attempt that art, which acts by nature's power. But what more? It would be better for such people to act, if they could, so that we might be made apes of Jesus Christ together with them, than to mock the labors of poets unknown to them, when it happens that they try to scratch the itch of others, and feel with anxiety the bloody claws of others on their own. Chapter 18 It is not a deadly crime to read the books of poets. These cavalry, nay, the judges of iniquity, desiring with a fervent rage the extermination of the poetic name, as if they had said a few words to it, cry out in a high voice from one side to the other, O illustrious men, O divine redeemed with blood, O people grateful to God, if any piety, if any devotion, if what love of the Christian religion, if you have any fear of God, throw away these unfortunate books of the poets, burn them with flames, and present the ashes to the winds. For to have them at home, to read them, even to wish to see them in any way, is a capital crime. They infect souls with deadly poison, drag you into Tartarus, and make you eternal exiles of the heavenly kingdom. After this, with increased clamor, they call Jerome to witness, and quote him as saying in the letter to Damasus about the prodigal son, the poems of the poets are the food of demons. And to these and many others like them, the ignorant listeners are chanting with a whole chorus. O mercy, O ancient faith, O great patience of God, what are you suffering? Why, the founder of things, do you turn the thunderbolts into upright towers, and into the lofty tops of the mountains? These, most holy Father, these are to be smitten, who, with deceitful tongues and liars, seek for themselves empty glory by the destruction of others and of the perpetually harmless. Doctors cover their errors with the earth, they try to hide their ignorance with prohibitions and flames. What simple man should hear these things, without thinking that poets are the most pernicious men, enemies of the divine name, companions of demons, merciless, evildoers, criminals always busy with works, in whom there is no concern for good arts, no piety, no faith, or sanctity. And thus, by the work and iniquity of these ignorant men, famous men obtain a disgrace which they do not at all deserve. But I hope, God will see one day. But let us see, if we can what is this so inexcusable evil that these sentients cry out if they are held, if they are seen, or if the poems of the poets are read. That the books should contain these things, that they should exhort, that they should condemn, that they should teach, has already been sufficiently declared above. But leaving them aside, I want to write and exhort the readers against the truth of these criminals. What at last? Gentile men were, who did not know Christ, who carried out their own, which they thought sacred, religion, and published fictions, always bearing the most pleasing and commendable fruits in their wombs. But what is the result? I ask these most elegant clamors, whether they are forbidden by some old or new doctrine to describe the crimes of their gods in whatever style they choose. Indeed, I do not think so, nor even to a pretending Christian, as long as a fiction, properly understood, is set against the Catholic truth, it bears no fruit. If not prohibited, if the laws do not forbid the reading of these, nor the prophets, nor the sacred pontifical sanctions, why hold, what is wrong with reading? They say, because they are seducers by their sweetness of mind. This objection was answered a little before, but if these are feeble and tractable, let them take heed to themselves, remembering the old proverb, by which it is forbidden, that those who have a glass helmet should not enter into a contest with stones. I admit, however, that it would be far better to study the sacred books than these, even if they are excellent, and I think that the students would be more acceptable to God, to the Supreme Pontiff, and to the Church, but not all, nor are we always drawn by the same affection, and thus some are never drawn to poetry. And if we are drawn, or we go into them of our own accord, what is this crime, what evil? We may with impunity listen to the manners of the barbarians, to speak the right, to join friendships with them, to celebrate banquets, to read the books of the poets, if it please God, we are forbidden by these learned men. No one prevents us from scrutinizing the execrable errors of Monichat, Arius, Philastia, and other heresiarches, so that we may know them, but to have read poetical works, as they cry out, is horrible, indeed, it is a deadly crime. We can see jesters playing most of the dishonest games, we can hear entertainers singing obscenities at banquets, thieves in taverns, robbers in taverns blaspheming, and we are not dragged into Tartarus for that. To have read the poetry of the poems makes us extorts of the eternal kingdom. It is right for a painter to paint the dog of the trick or Bez, Didas guarding the thresholds, Charon the sailor, Acheron's boats furrowing, the urchins girded with hydras and armed with torches, Pluto himself, the prince of the unhappy kingdom, the executioner of the condemned. That the poet has written these same words in a sonorous poem is a crime, and an unforgivable crime to the reader. The same painter was granted, in the courts of kings and noblemen, to paint the loves of old, the crimes of gods and men, and any other comments of any person, without any decree prohibiting the fathers, and this was permitted to be viewed by anyone at will, the inventions of the poets, adorned with lineaments, or read by the wise and wont to infect the minds more than the paintings are examined by the ignorant. What a lot. I fail, I confess, desiring, if I could, to notice, by what force, by what power, the consuming bruise, and the ignorance, could drive these drunkards into such great insanity. They ought at least to have known, because the vessel of choice was a witness, to know that evil was not evil, but to work, and the last preceptors themselves, I believe, to be considered more prudent by their wives and thence they get fatter shots, they should not be afraid to say, let alone say they know, but that reading poets is most pernicious. So loath to hear, even if the poets are altogether to be despised, it would be unwise, if you see, to pick a pearl out of the mud, as if the dust that could be wiped away made it less precious. Nor are these interpreters ashamed, by this presumptuous and general prohibition of theirs, that they wish to make a lie out of the truth, if the poet ever said, nay, they deny with their whole mouth that they said it. It is ridiculous to hear that the devil, the enemy of the human race, could ever have spoken a good word, but poets, let it be against my conscience that a little while ago I conceded that they were evil, when perhaps no one could be accused of any dishonor beyond gentility, of having been unable to say a good word. The devil is also never called to witness by holy men, to have invoked the poet on the authority of these accusers is an unforgivable crime. But now I beseech these prohibitors and preachers of the exile of poets, let them say, what could poetry have sinned more than philosophy? Indeed, philosophy is the best investigator of truth, but poetry is the most faithful guardian under the veil, if she felt less right, she could not have kept that right. He is on foot, sir, it is necessary to follow his footsteps, if that deviates, and this, as it is exorbitant, is compelled by necessity. What, then, when we accuse the Gentile philosophers with our mouths full and keep their opinions, and do almost nothing but confirm their offenses by their authority, we shudder at the sayings of the poets, and condemn them in detestation. Socrates is extolled, Plato is honored, Aristotle is worshipped, so that among the rest they are allowed to be all Gentiles and men constantly condemned by erroneous opinions. Homer is driven away by our accusers, Hesiod is condemned, Maris is despised, and Flaccus, whose figures have no other meaning than their discussions. Of those who study dogma and from these, be with difficulty, not with patient intellect, they have taken certain principles, as if recommending the understanding. As for the poets, because they neglect what is written, and thus do not understand it, they despise and condemn it. However, whatever they cry out, whatever they bark at, whatever they command or suggest, if the writings of philosophers, if the deeds of barbarians, if the treachery of heretics can be read, and the volumes of poets can be read, held, and heard without a curse, yet with a whole and constant mind, lest, if ever something and they would call the faith a dogma, as if foreign readers were to allow themselves to be swayed by it. But now it remains for the extremity of these clamors to be pressed more sharply and more protractedly, because they believe that they have confirmed all the previous things by the authority of that most famous and holy man. Then they say, crying out, Jerome's word to Pope Damasus, the poems of the poets are the food of demons. Which, if they had understood enough of what had already been said, they would also have noticed what was confirmed by us, and most likely where we have already said once and again before that the condemned filthiness and rejection of comics. But since, with no distinction made by the poets, and obscured by the darkness of envy, upon whomsoever they fall, their cowardice must be repulsed, and they themselves forced into silence forever. If, therefore, they had diligently read the epistles, if the volumes of Jerome, if they had read this very thing, which they produce as a witness, or by whose authority they want the poets condemned, they would certainly have found this word declared by Jerome. And the meaning of it, and the objection which they make, is to be resolved, and most likely from the figure of a captive woman, with her head shaved, her clothes laid down, her nails cut off, and her hair removed, to marry an Israelite. And if they do not wish to be more religious and delicate than the holy teachers, they will find that this demonic food, not only was not thrown into the flames, as they order, but was carefully preserved, handled, and tasted by Fulgentius, the doctor and Catholic pontiff, as appears in that book, which he himself calls mythology, in which he described in the most elegant style the stories of the poets, expounding them. In this way they will discover that Augustine, an excellent teacher, was not afraid of poetry, nor of poetic songs, but rather that he studied and understood with skillful vigilance, which, if they wished to deny, they could not when especially in his volumes the holy man introduces Virgil and other poets, and almost never mentions Virgil without some title of praise. Thus, as I have said again, Jerome, an excellent and most holy teacher, and wonderfully learned in 3 languages, whom these people, in their ignorance, endeavor to draw as a witness, will perceive that he studied the poems of the poets with such care, and preserved them by memory, that he seems to have confirmed almost nothing without their testimony. Let them see, if they do not believe, among other things, the prologue to his book on Hebrew questions, and let them notice whether they think that he was entirely a Terentian, let them see whether, in particular, he brings Horace and Virgil to himself as assertors, and not only these, but also the Persians and others. Let them read, moreover, the most eloquent epistle of the same to Augustine, and inquire whether in it, among the illustrious men, a learned poet those whom they themselves try to confound with so much clamor, if they can, let him enumerate. Moreover, if they do not know, let them read the Acts of the Apostles, and feel whether Paul, the vessel of choice, studied the new poetic verses. Indeed, they will find that he was not disgusted, arguing against the obstinacy of the Athenians at the Areopagus, as the poets testify, and the use of the comic poem by Menander elsewhere, when he said, good manners are corrupted by bad conversations. And the poet of Epimenides, if I remember, alleges a verse which could be most aptly said against these, saying, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy bellies. And so it is not that he who has been caught up to the third heaven, as these holiers want, has thought it a sin or a shame to have read and learned the poems of the poets. Moreover, let them examine what Dionysius the Areopagite, the disciple of Paul and the eminent martyr of Christ, wrote, in his book of the Heavenly Hierarchy. For he purposely says, pursues, and proves that divine theology uses poetic fictions, saying, among other things, and reforming the anagogical holy scriptures to him, and many other things which follow from this opinion. And, in order to allow the rest, whom I could bring against their bestiality, did not our Lord and Saviour himself speak many things in parables, in a comical style? Did he not also use the words of Terentius against Paulus prostrate, namely, that it is hard for you to kick against the spur? It is true that I think Christ the Lord is far from Terentius, however long he may have been before. How much these things have been said, that the words have assumed. It is sufficient for me to affirm that our Lord and Saviour willed whenever his word and sentence were uttered by the mouth of Terentius, so that it may appear that the poems of the poets are not altogether the food of demons. Now what will the illustrious poets say? Will they cry out? Will they insult against the poems of poets rejected by his own testimony and defeated and rejected by the testimony of many other holy men? Indeed, they will cry out, their rage is insurmountable. But how just, you see, O king, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. It is sufficient for me to affirm that our Lord and Saviour willed whenever his word and sentence were uttered by the mouth of Terentius, so that it may appear that the poems of the poets are not altogether the food of demons. Now what will the illustrious poets say? Will they cry out? Will they insult against the poems of poets rejected by his own testimony and defeated and rejected by the testimony of many other holy men? Indeed, they will cry out, their rage is insurmountable. But how just, you see, O king, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. It is sufficient for me to affirm that our Lord and Saviour willed whenever his word and sentence were uttered by the mouth of Terentius, so that it may appear that the poems of the poets are not altogether the food of demons. Now what will the illustrious poets say? Will they cry out? Will they insult against the poems of poets rejected by his own testimony and defeated and rejected by the testimony of many other holy men? Indeed, they will cry out, their rage is insurmountable. But how just, you see, O king, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. So that it appears that the poems of the poets are not entirely food for demons. Now what will the illustrious poets say? Will they cry out? Will they insult against the poems of poets rejected by his own testimony and defeated and rejected by the testimony of many other holy men? Indeed, they will cry out, their rage is insurmountable. But how just, you see, O king, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. So that it appears that the poems of the poets are not entirely food for demons. Now what will the illustrious poets say? Will they cry out? Will they insult against the poems of poets rejected by his own testimony and defeated and rejected by the testimony of many other holy men? Indeed, they will cry out, their rage is insurmountable. But how just, you see, O king, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. The king very well, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. The king very well, and let them see to whom reason is more friendly than the obstinate obstinacy of these. But to those who condemn them so absolutely, the most just judge, God, will one day recompense their merit with envy, and they will be measured with the same measure with which they are measured to others. Chapter 19. Not all poets are driven to the cities by order of Plato. At the very least it seemed that our robbers had exposed all their efforts to exclude the poets from the houses and from the hands of men, if they could. And therefore behold, once more formed in a train, they rush in, and, armed with the authority of Plato, belch out strangely sonorous voices, saying that, by order of Plato, the already mentioned poets are to be driven into the cities. Hence, in order to help Plato who was failing, they added, lest they infect the manners of the citizens with their lasciviousness. To which objection, and if a sufficient answer is seen in the above, he will not hesitate to answer again more fully. I confess, then, that this is the greatest authority of the philosopher, and is not to be rejected, if it is indeed understood, concerning the meaning of which they certainly feel either nothing, or perversely, as will appear. It was shown to them, however, that the poets of their own accord dwell in deserts, for which reason they called them mountaineers and foolish men. But if they violently inhabited the cities, what would these morsels say? They would say that they are tyrants. But if they now wish to turn the opinion and call them worshippers of the cities, it is false. It is certain that Homer, after a long world, lived among the rugged rocks and the mountains of forests, on the shores of the Arctic, at the ends of poverty, and seeing there in his mind, yet seized with ill health, he dictated those huge and admirable volumes, not to Aeneas, but to Castelioeus, pearled with honey, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Virgil, with a genius not inferior to Homer, the city of Rome, then the mistress of things, being neglected, and having abandoned Octavian Caesar, the ruler of the whole world, whose friendship was singularly felicitous, sought for himself not far from Naples, a city famous in Campania, then also abounding in pleasures and leisure, isolated a quiet and solitary place close to the coast, as the man of great spirit, John Barioles, said, between the promontory of Posilipi and Putolos, the most ancient colony of the Greeks, to whom almost no one approached unless he complained, in which, after Gorgias, he sang the celestial song Aeneid. Octavianus, desiring to bear witness to his chosen solitude, when he had caused the bones of the same Virgil to be brought from Brundisum, ordered them to be buried not far from the chosen solitude, otherwise that road, which is still called Putolana, so that the dead, who have chosen to live in its vicinity, should lie there. And let us not always wander through the ancients, that the assailants, no matter how much they are strengthened by auspicious testimony, easily deny. Francis Petrarch, certainly a heavenly man and the most famous poet of our age, do not we, scorn western Babylon and the great papal benevolence, which almost all Christians desire and procure, and the captains of the world, and other princes, went into a closed valley, a distinguished place in the wilderness of Gaul, where was Sorgia, the king of the fountains, born, and there he spent almost all his flowery youth, contented with obeying a single governor, meditating and composing. Indeed, he did. The traces stand and will stand for a long time, a small house in a garden, and, as long as it pleases God, many witnesses live. If, then, lest I repeat too many, it is so, it is not at all expedient for Oedipal, that anyone should spend his labors on this, to drive the poets away from the cities. However, I would like to hear from these people, do they think that Plato, when he wrote the book of his Republic, in which this is commended, which they say, he understood about Homer, that is, if the city pleased him, he would have been expelled from the city? I do not know what they will answer, but I do not believe, since I have already read much praise about him. For the most sacred laws of the Caesars call him the father of all the virtues, and most especially their bearers in order to make them worthy of greater veneration, and to strengthen them with a kind of sacred testimony, never to mix Homer's poems among them, as the poem is read at the end of the prologue of Justinian's Codex of the Iliad, and in the same title under the title of Justice and Law, thus also of the purchase to be contracted, and of ambassadors and trustees of faith, and other places, as those who believe less may know in the Pison Pandecta. Moreover, many of the Greeks wanted their citizen to be their citizen, even when he was dead and poor. They claim, the Salaminians repeat it, but the Smyrnaeans confirm that it is theirs, and therefore they also dedicated his slander in the town. Many others, moreover, fight and contend with each other. This Tullius, which I also remember to have read from an ancient Greek poem, quite popular among the learned, saying thus: Sigma mu omicron, sigma mu rho nu eta, chi omicron kappa omicron lambda omicron phi nu, pi lambda omicron, rho gamma omicron, theta nu alpha iota, which sounds in Latin. 7 states dispute about the root of Omer, Samos, Smyrna, Chios, Colophon, Pylos, Argos, Athens. Moreover, Plato himself, in the same book of the Rhetos, publicly and repeatedly brings his conclusions to bear witness. If, therefore, the father of the virtues was regarded by the laws, if the law was worthy, if the citizen of so many states was also repeated, if he was taken as a witness by the preceptor Plato himself, it is most foolish to think that Plato, the most prudent man, ordered such a poet to be banished from the city. Moreover, we will imagine that Memnium was driven into the city by the order of Plato, who, content with honest poverty, was so dear to the Scipios because of his valor. Indeed, to men not only conspicuous for their generosity in arms and war and blood, but distinguished for their domestic philosophy and sanctity of manners, so that after his death they also wished to mingle the ashes of their own and their ancestors, and to bury their graves. If these believe it, I do not believe it, but rather think that Plato wished his city to be filled with such people. Moreover, what shall we say of Solon, who, given the Athenian laws, though he was already old, indulged himself in poetry? Shall we say that the city should not be driven away, who restored the dissolute city to civil life and manners? What, moreover, of our Virgil, whose, to allow the rest, so much blushing of the brow and shame of mind among his contemporaries and whomever he heard of less decency, that for this reason the young man was still called Parthenius, which in Latin sounds Virgo or virginity, whose counsels to virtue are so many, as it has already been said, that they are the words of his mighty poems. In order that his divine work might not be burnt, as Virgil himself had commanded when he was dying, Octavianus Caesar Augustus, having postponed the greatest care of the empire, composed prohibitory verses, which are still read in our time, whose name is still celebrated with such honor among the Mantuans, that when they are unable to worship the ashes taken by Augustus for their vows, they worship his old calf, named by him in the likeness of a living man. They show their young children as a kind of venerable sacred old parents, and to foreigners who come, as their own increasing their glory, they indicate diligently. Do not these things proceed without the chief evidence of virtue, and shall we believe that Plato commanded us to drive the virtuous out of the city? O foolish chapter! I could say much about the oration of Flaccus, of Curtius Volterra, of Juvenal Aquinas, by which it was evident to the clearness of Plato's mind that such men were not driven to the city, but the mind draws me to enter the vices, and add that they cannot be denied by any slander. Am I to believe, then, that Plato was so insane that he decided to drive Francis Petrarch out of the city? He who, leading a celibate life from his youth, so foolishly abhors the impurity of Venus, that to those who know him he is the most holy example of the honest man, whose lie is the deadly enemy, who is the execrare of all vices, and the venerable shrine of truth, the adornment and happiness of virtues, and the standard of Catholic holiness, pious, meek, and devout, and so shy, that the other should be judged Parthenius. He is, moreover, the glory of poetical ability, a sweet and eloquent orator, to whom, when all the bays of philosophy are open, he has a genius beyond human perspicacity, a tenacious memory, and of all things, as a man can be, full of information. Whence his works, both prosaic and metrical, of which there are many, shine with such splendor, reek with such sweetness, are visible in such flowery ornamentation, and sweet flowing with the charm of sounding words, and flavored with the wonderful juice of sentences, that they may be believed to have been wrought by the artifice of heavenly genius rather than by man. What should I say? Indeed, he surpasses man, and far surpasses the strength of mortals. Nor do I preach these praises as if I were commending an ancient man who had died long ago, but rather, as long as it pleases God, I am reporting the merits of a living and strong man, which, O excellent morticians, if you do not believe my letters, you can see with your own eyes. Nor do I doubt that, as Claudian says, the presence diminishes fame, as it is wont to happen to most famous men, nay, I boldly assert because his presence will survive the fame. For he is conspicuous by such majesty of manners, by such sweet eloquence, and also by such politeness in composed old age, that it may be said of what is read of Socrates by the moral philosopher Seneca, that his hearers drew their doctrine more from manners than from words. And, that I may never speak of this most famous man, let them tell me whether such poets are driven from the city by Plato. And if they are driven in this way, they will open those whom the citizens themselves are about to introduce. Will he take on the Lenons or the rascals, and the gnats, the opulents, and so on, or perhaps thieves or the like? O happy, O long-lasting republic of Plato, if it drives out poets and has these citizens and presiders of the manners and life of men. But it is far from being arbitrarily understood by the most learned man what these interpreters feel, and I do not think so, and distinguished poets, and that any others like them were not only citizens of the states or of their republic, but leaders and teachers. But they ask indignantly, if not these, whose skin does Plato command to poets? It should be answered to such, you yourselves inquire, you foolish censors. But since the ignorance of anyone is to be pitied, and if they are ill-deserved, we must nevertheless be pitied. It is necessary to use all liquors in this way, and according to their means, the weed, which may be abominable and to be thrown away, is not defiled, and thus ability. For what is philosophy, the teacher of all things, more truthful? In this bitter place, to say nothing of the rest, she had the cynics and the Epicureans, who, wrapped up in strange errors, generally tried to dishonor her in nothing, so much so that they were seen as enemies rather than ministers. But I pray, because of these Socrates, Xenocrates, Anaxagoras, Paintius, and shall we say that others, distinguished by the same title, will be thrown away? It would be the duty of a fool and a coward. What is the Christian religion more holy? And he made the Donatists, the Macedonians, the Phocians, and other heresiarches far more foul and execrable. Nor shall we just say that Basil of Caesarea, John Chrysostom, Ambrose of Milan, Pope Leo, and other holy and venerable men are profaned because of these. Thus also poetry, to say nothing of the rest, had its own excrement, so that there were some who were called comic poets, among whom, if not among them, there were honest men such as Plautus and Terentius, who were seen to infect the glory of their splendid poetry by their most vile fictions. And Ovid of Polygnon may sometimes be joined to these. These, indeed, either innate lasciviousness of mind, or lust for gain, and longing for popular applause, composed wicked fables, introduced by mimes, they recited them in the scenes, from which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was agitated, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. Introduced by mimes, they recited in scenes, from which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was stirred up, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. Introduced by mimes, they recited in scenes, from which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was stirred up, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. They recited in scenes, from which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was stirred up, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. They recited in scenes, from which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was stirred up, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. From which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was stirred up, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. From which the bosoms of the lascivious were provoked into crimes, and the virtue of the steadfast was stirred up, and almost every discipline of manners was rendered energetic. And what was most pernicious was that, however detestable the religion of the Gentiles might be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. However detestable the religion of the Gentiles may be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. However detestable the religion of the Gentiles may be in other respects, they had led the people into such base rites, that even their own people seemed ashamed of them. Indeed, poets of this kind, as has been said in the preceding section, are not only repulsed by the Christian religion, but also by the Gentiles themselves. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. Not only is the Christian religion repugnant, but Gentiles itself also rejects it. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. Not only is the Christian religion repugnant, but Gentiles itself also rejects it. For these are those whom I think Plato ordered to be driven out of the city, but I think that such people should be exterminated, not in the city, but in the world. But is it because of these that Exiat, Euripides, Statius, Claudian, or the like, should not be driven out of the city? I don't think so. Let them therefore distinguish themselves, and if they do not work with hatred against the unworthy, they seize the ill-deserved, leaving their own visible in peace. Chapter 20 The Muses cannot be infected because of the lack of playfulness of any character. No differently than if they were women of the flesh, because their names are of the feminine gender, they proclaim them to be dishonorable, obscene, witches, and harlots, and, because Boethius uses the diminutive, they consider them to be in the extreme lot, and in the extreme even in the Luthanari, prostrated by the common people. And this is not enough, for on this account they want the poets to be dishonest men as well, thus leading their argument. Familiarity cannot be united or established except by the concordance of manners, but it is clear that they are the most familiar poets, even as their poems testify, and thus, as has already been said, they are dishonest people. Do you notice, most prudent king, to what end the cunning of these allurements tends? But, whatever it may be, it must be confused with the bright truth. Therefore, how many and what muses there are, and by what distinguished names, and what illustrious men have felt by them, if I remember well, I have shown above the 10th book of the first of this work. Therefore, I think it is sufficient to infer from what has been said, that there is a double species of poets, one of which is venerable and praiseworthy, and always acceptable to pious men, while the other is obscene and detestable, and that is the poets whom I said should be banished not only from the city, but from the world. In the same way the horse can be said of the muses, of which even if there is one genus, there can be said to be two species, for, given the same powers and the same laws, each one actually uses each one, when it seems that the juice of a different exactness is expressed, namely, this sweet, that bitter, we may not incongruously consider one honorable and the other dishonorable. The second of these, then, to be commended by all the sermons, is the groves inhabited by laurel, the fountain of Castalia, and the venerable places of whatever religion we know, the companion of Phoebus, adorned with flowers and wreaths, and spectacular with the sweetness of song and the sonority of voices, and the other is that which, treated by dishonest comedians, holds the stages and theatres in quadruple roads, and with criminal fictions, for the reward of the idle common people, presents itself placidly without any commendable adornment. He does not soothe or cure the ailments of the languishing, not by the consolation of virtues, not by salutary antidotes, not even by sacred remedies, but by complaints and groans even to death he amplifies that pleasure with which the afflicted are delighted, from whom they can sufficiently see what they did not know, the hostile poets, namely Boethius, while he was calling the muses the theatrical harlots, he understood the theatrical appearance of the muses. What these objectors could have seen most openly, if they had understood what was said after a little while from philosophy, for he says, but leave him to the muses to be cared for and healed by me. And, in order that it may appear more clearly, since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. That he had understood the theatrical appearance of the muses. What these objectors could have seen most openly, if they had understood what was said after a little while from philosophy, for he says, but leave him to the muses to be cared for and healed by me. And, in order that it may appear more clearly, since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. That he had understood the theatrical appearance of the muses. What these objectors could have seen most openly, if they had understood what was said after a little while from philosophy, for he says, but leave him to the muses to be cared for and healed by me. And, in order that it may appear more clearly, since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. They would have understood what had been said by philosophy after a little, for he says, but leave him to the muses to be cared for and healed by me. And, in order that it may appear more clearly, since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. They would have understood what had been said by philosophy after a little, for he says, but leave him to the muses to be cared for and healed by me. And, in order that it may appear more clearly, since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. Since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. Since he was speaking of the second species of the muses, he always introduces in the following philosophy, for the care and consolation of Boethius, in the same book, the amusements of poems and poetical fictions. Therefore, after philosophy mixes them with its artifice, they must be thought to be honorable, and if they are honest, and those with whom they are familiar, as the deduction of these seems to want, it is necessary that men should be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. It is necessary for men to be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. It is necessary for men to be honest. And thus the muse is honest, and the poet honest are men, whom and whom they have tried to undermine each other by a foul name into the void. Chapter XXI. The author addresses the king. By these reasonings, most merciful king, I was able to repulse the curses of these zealots, and, if I had not spared my honesty, I would have attacked their reckless presumption in their lives and manners with far sharper words and sharper stings. I think, however, that they would have said many things before what was said, to which they wished to answer all. The speech would be extended too long, and an excessive multitude of words is always wont to offend not only those who are occupied with great minds, as they are of royalty, but also those who are empty and idle. And in this regard, lest I should be weary of your highness, and lest it should be seen that you wish to drive these people out of the borders of the earth, since it is rather to sympathize with their ignorance than to proceed to the merit of their extermination, it is the mind to put an end to them, and that which they themselves would not do, I want you to end this book with grace, that is to say, to put down all deserved wrath, and to be ignorant of their wickedness. Chapter 22. The author prays to the enemies of the poet's name, that they may turn to a better plan. You therefore, O prudent men, now, if you are wise, put aside your anger and calm your turgid breasts, for enough, nay, too much has been contested between us with hatreds. You were the first to take arms against the innocent, that you might exterminate them from the world, with your strength and mine, you would no late penance. The war was fought, however, and the wind came to such a degree that with some glory of the offensive, although with much sweat, there was a little of the suppressed lust of conquering, and that, by the laws of the horses, he could go to peace. Let us go, therefore, and seize it on the other side, and give rest to our labors, for the rewards of war are balanced. For you, I will bring back a little consolation as a lesson, and thus a sufficient place of peace was left. I believe that you like this, because he repents that he took you, and therefore let us enjoy his good things. In order that you may know me from my heart, who was the first to be smitten, I will first begin to observe the laws of friendship, and, so that you may do likewise, that I am about to say a few things as a friend in charity, proceed with a calm mind. Behold, honorable men, by demonstrations to whom I was able, I made clear what poetry is, which you yourselves did not do at all, who are poets, what the duty of poets, what manners, which you also cried out as fables, criminal men, instigators of crimes, and infected with 1,000 evils. I have pointed out what the muses are, whom you called harlots, and perhaps you thought were wolves. If they are so valuable, if they are so venerable, you ought not only not to condemn them, but to worship them, to praise them, to love them, and to make them better, to study their volumes. Lest your older age, or your more famous abilities, should hold you back from this, try among yourselves to be able to do that which was not ashamed of himself as an aged prince and singularly worthy of all the virtues, Robert, renowned king of Jerusalem and Sicily. He who was once a famous philosopher and an excellent preceptor in medicine, and among the rest of his time a remarkable theologian, when he had hanged Virgil in the 66th year of his age, and called him with the rest, in your manner, a legendary man, and would be of no value, stripped of the ornament of poems. As soon as Francis Petrarch he heard the sense referring to the mysterious poems, he rebuked himself in astonishment, and, as I, speaking of him, heard with my own ears, he asserted that he had never before imagined that such excellent and sublime feelings could hide under such a ridiculous shell, as the fictions of poets. As he observed that behind the demonstration of skill men were hidden, and with his wonderful compunction he condemned the genius and the misfortune, which had so late learned the art of poetry, and was not ashamed, he began to pay attention. Of course, a hasty death interrupted a new study, which if it had been possible to continue, who doubts that it would have turned out to be the greatest honor of the poets and the advantage of the Italines in such a vacant study? What then? What the most wise king thought holy, will you lead to seize the unworthy? I can hardly believe it, for I do not think you are tigers or wild beasts, whose intelligence cannot be bent for the better by the use of their savagery. However, if, beyond this pious credulity, my impetuous in your breast still persists an undeserved hostile ardor, in yours at least it is worthy, as often as your tongue itches in words, I beseech you through the sacred breast of philosophy, whose breasts you have perhaps once sucked, lest you become so much a poetic name given the precipice, nay, if you are sane enough, always make use of distinction, where it is opportune. She, indeed, brings discord into harmony, and, being wiped away by the mists of ignorance, clarifies the understanding, and directs the intellect where it wills. And do this, lest you dishonor the venerable poets, of whom it has been shown that many were Gentiles. Let it be enough for you to rush into comic temptations, to vomit anger at these, to cry out at these, on these, the good peace of the rest, all of you will be turned to fire. Moreover, and spare the Hebrews, for they cannot without the indignation of the divine majesty, and it has been pre-demonstrated, testifying to Jerome, that some of his prophecies were uttered under the poetic style, dictated by the Holy Spirit. In the same way, moreover, Christians are to be kept immune from injury, for many of our poets were, and still are, who, under the cover of their fictions, commended the devout and sacred sentiments of the Christian religion. And, as something has been shown from many things, our Dante's, given to write in his mother's language, but in an artificial way, in a book which he called the Comedy, has brilliantly designated the threefold state of the dead according to the teaching of sacred theology. And the famous and last poet, Francis Petrarch, in his Boccaccio, under the pastoral cover of the speech of the true God and the glorious Trinity, marked the praises and wrath of him on the treading of the cowardly boat of Peter with a wonderful description. The volume stand and the meaning appears to those who want to understand. The songs of Prudentius and Sedelius are more powerful than these, discovering the truth under the sacred veil. And Erator, not only a Christian man, but a priest and a pivot of the Roman Church, described the deeds of the apostles in a heroic song by singing in a poetic manner. Moreover, Juvencus, a Spanish man, but also a Christian, under the guise of a man, an ox, an eagle, and a lion of Christ, the Son of the living God, our Redeemer, composed all the acts also by impersonation. And, lest I bring many into the middle, if, as ours spared at least, no humanity draws you, do not be more severe with our mother, the Church, who, looking ahead with a laudable consideration, does not disdain to be kind to many, and most of all to Origen. For this man's powers of composition were so great, that his genius seems never to have been exhausted. Nor was his hand weary in writing, from which it is believed that he exceeded thousands of volumes of various materials. From all of which, after the manner of a skillful maiden, who gathers unharmed flowers among thorn bushes with her fingers, and allows the thorns of thorns to fade separately, leaving aside the less well-believed ones, she took to be praised, and wished to be kept among her treasures, which are less sacredly written, allow. But those who are blessed, do not condemn them, as if you thought that, by raising a clamor for the poets, Augustine or Jerome would be judged by an ignorant people. For these, to whom prudence was a mare with sanctity, never turned rumors into poetry or poetical artifice, but into the errors of the Gentiles recited by them, which they always condemned with a fearless voice, even by those around them who were enemies and recalcitrants of the Catholic truth. Otherwise we should always worship them, observing that their writings are composed with such artful words, so sweet with so much charm, so seasoned with the salt of sentences, and adorned with so much ornamentation, that it seems almost necessary to seek from them whatever beauty one wishes to add to the Latin speech. And, lest I drag you on with a long speech, as Cicero says for Archia, these studies serve youth, they delight old age, they adorn secondary things, they provide refuge and comfort from adversity, they delight at home, they do not hinder us abroad, they spend the night with us, they travel abroad, they become rural, if we ourselves could neither touch nor taste with our senses, so we should wonder at them even when we see them in others, etc. Since, therefore, poetry is not to be discarded, nor to be thrown away, but to be worshipped, and hence the poet, if you are wise, enough has been said, but if you obstinately persist in rage, let me have compassion on you, when you are thirsty for rebuking.